This is Chris Wade with the South Carolina Public Safety Chaplains Association. Today we're getting to know some of the chaplains in our state, and we're with Chaplain Sam Turbeville. Sam, well, thank you for joining me today. So what public safety agency do you work with, and how long have you been there?
Well, Chris, first, thank you for inviting me to this. Not very comfortable, so if your viewers are watching, they may pick up on some of that. But I work with the Florence Police Department. I'm a volunteer chaplain with the Florence Police Department and have been since 2016.
Okay, what do you like about working and being a chaplain there?
Well, I grew up in Florence, and I have a long history with Florence Police Department. I started there as a police explorer back in 1983 until 1987. I was a police explorer, and we did a lot of the competitions with local police explorer units, things like felony traffic stop, elementary traffic stop, search warrants, things like that. So when I started as a police officer in 2003 there, I remember some of the officers that I knew as a police explorer saying the prodigal son has returned. So that's why I enjoy the Florence Police Department. It's in my hometown and I know the people.
Okay. So what was your faith tradition growing up?
My earliest memory was in the Pentecostal Holiness Church. My mom said that when we got to, a certain age, she said that she was kind of scared of that church herself, the talking in tongues and falling down on the floor. And so we started going to an Episcopal church, and I was baptized in the Episcopal church when I was 12 and have been Episcopalian ever since.
Okay. So tell me about your family.
I'm married. I met my wife, Sarah, when I lived in Chicago. We have no children, and moved from Chicago to San Jose, California, lived there for about 3 years, and then moved back home to Florence. My mother and father still live here in Florence. My father was the chief of airport police and fire rescue and security at the time when I was little. So I always grew up either in the fire truck or the police truck on the airport property. I have a younger brother and a younger sister, and a niece. She lives in Florida. I love to play with her when they come to visit.
What were you doing in San Jose, you said?
San Jose. Worked for a Japanese semiconductor company that relocated us from Illinois to California so that it was closer with Japan's time.
Okay, that sounds a little different than what you're doing now.
Well, like I said, when I grew up in the church, and all along my family members would pat me on the head and say, "You're going to be a preacher one day," and it just didn't seem right. I thank them for the compliment, but it just didn't seem like me. But I was always close to the Lord. I was the Episcopalian representative on the religious council at the Citadel, and I taught Sunday school. I sang in the church choir. I did everything in the church that, a person growing up in the church would do. I just never felt called to the pulpit. After my graduation from the Citadel, I started my corporate career that took me to Chicago and then California. And I was laid off in California and moved back to South Carolina. And that was basically the time when couldn't find work. Laid off in 2001, and it was a bad economic time. Couldn't find work comparable to what I'd been doing. I had an MBA that I got when I was in Illinois, but couldn't get back into that work. And I finally decided to put in an application for the police department because that's where my love was. And I got a job as a police officer, and felt like I was the accidental police officer because, like you said, I had work experience in production management, in semiconductors and power backup equipment. I worked with a company that made the power conditioners at every point of sale station for Walmart. So long story to say, production management, lean management was where my heart was. Just never had a ministry opportunity.
Mm-hmm. So what other ministries are you involved with?
Well, when I started my ministry, I'm ordained as a deacon in the Episcopal Church. And when I was getting ready to go into the ordination process, the mentor, facilitator for the training program, said, don't get too attached to what you think God's plan for your life is, because it might change. And I thought, no, thank you for the advice, but mine's to be a police chaplain. That's what I'm going to be. Thank you for that advice. And as soon as I was ordained, in a month later, I was appointed as a chaplain, the volunteer chaplain for the police department. And I did that for about a year by vocational. I had a vocation and I did the volunteer work. And I remember telling my buddies, I said, I really wish I could get paid to be a chaplain. And not soon after that, an opportunity opened up to be a chaplain at McLeod Hospital. And I took that job and have been here since January 2019. No, 18, sorry. January 2018, I started here. And so that is my other ministry, which is now my paying ministry, is a chaplain in the hospital. But if you would have asked me back when I was pursuing that ordination to pursue the being a chaplain in the police department, I would have said, I'm not working in the hospital. Mm-hmm. That's not my calling.
You find much difference between your being a chaplain in the hospital and being a chaplain out in the streets?
Well, my hesitation for being a chaplain in the hospital was I thought that the only people in the hospital are people who are old and dying. But what I found out the minute I stepped here is that I had a close affinity for the nurses, especially those in the critical care units and in the ER. They're just like first responders. They're just like the police officers. They see chaos and they bring order to that chaos, stabilize a patient. And it's not just old people and dying people. It's anybody that's had a trauma that's coming into the ER.
Yeah. And like you, I work at a hospital. I seem to have an affinity towards my ICU folks and my emergency department folks. Because yeah, they do. They're just like my first responders. You know, they deal with the crisis. They deal with the craziness of the call. You never know what's going to roll through that door next.
Right. They see the things that humans shouldn't have to see. They see the abuses of humanity. They see the tragedies of humanity, the brokenness of humanity. And it takes a toll. One of the things I've loved about SCPSCA is the training that we've had in moral injury and PTSD. That's been very, very important training for me in this role, kind of dual role of hospital and police.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned a little bit about your background, but so what other background in public safety do you have? I mean, you had your dad who was involved in the Florence airport, was it?
Yeah, Florence Regional Airport, which for me, that was another personal connection I had this past January when one of the officers was shot and killed at the airport. Because I'd grown up there. And so looking over and seeing the body of the officer lying on the ground, really, I connected with that and that fear that I had as a little boy riding with my dad as he patrolled the airport and always worried that that would happen to him. Because my dad, back in the day, didn't have a vest. He had a .357 revolver on his hip. Backup was a long way away. I mean, he was like Marshall Dillon out there. And, that's where my love for law enforcement and fire came in. And so for me personally, this past January was difficult. And then I thought January's over. And it's gotten worse since then. Here we are in the middle of this COVID pandemic. And I mean, 2020 has been the worst year ever. If you were looking to plan it.
Yeah, it's not been good. It's not been good.
But sorry, your question was about my experience.
Yeah.
As I said, I got a job with the police department in 2003 in patrol at Florence, and I enjoyed that thoroughly. I even had, before I left, I had an award for the #1 DUI arrests in the 12th Judicial Network. And so I was pleased by that because DUIs are difficult. Very few people like to do them. They take long. You have to make sure you dot all of the I's and cross all of the T's. and you could lose the case based on some loophole you didn't even foresee. And so a lot of people avoid that. But drunk driving is another one of those things that take out people that we love. And so if you don't have people that enforce that law, it's not good for society.
Yeah. So what do you love about being a chaplain?
What I love about being a chaplain is even when I was a police officer and I would take somebody to jail, I especially hear them in the back seat saying, well, I've just ruined my life. This DUI is going to ruin my life. And I remember kind of telling them, no, this is just a bad decision. This isn't defining your life. What you do with it defines your life. And it was almost a preaching moment, captive audience, if you will, as we rode down to Effingham. But what I noticed in police officers is they have a heart to serve others, but they're very rule specific. They don't see people as being redeemable because they see the person in the back seat with the crocodile tears that's all sorry for getting caught, and they know that they're going to get caught next week. They're going to get caught the week after. Those police officers see clergy that are abusing children. So in the minds of an officer, if you're not a police officer, you're kind of suspect. And so they don't have a lot of grace. And the sad thing is when they fall, because there's so much freedom out there for law enforcement officers, they start off, everyone probably starts off with the right intent, but something out there, some bait traps them, ensnares them, and then they lose that brotherhood that they put all of their trust in. And as a chaplain, you're there to remind them that Jesus died for you, and that if you've put your trust in him, he's forgotten your sin. He's forgiven you for your sin, and you can have a new life. And they're not used to that because they are black and white. And it's just awful to see because they mean well. My desire to be the chaplain, or my feeling of a calling to be the chaplain, is to reach those who don't know Christ, because they could get taken out in a moment. And it doesn't matter how good they've lived their life and how much of a sacrifice they have made. What matters is where they put their trust. And they need to hear that. They need a chaplain, because most of them can't go to church on a regular basis. Most of them don't go to church on a regular basis. And so they need a chaplain that's with them, that knows them, and somebody that they can call when they get in trouble or before they get in trouble. That's really the key. As a chaplain, you need to be out there and among the people so that you can watch behavior and say, hey, you're not acting the same, or hey, I haven't seen you do whatever you've been doing in a while. Why'd you stop that? Because it's in watching those behavior changes that we start to see when people are in need of help, rather than just sit back and wait for somebody to call you. Because chances are, and I think you said this in a blog once before, in the moment of a crisis, it's not the time for an introduction. Hey, I'm Sam, I'm your chaplain. Thank you. Where have you been?
Yeah, they won't have anything to do with you at that point if they don't know you. So if you were asked by someone who felt called to get into chaplain ministry, how would you direct them?
Well, for me, I can only talk to my experience. After I was a police officer here, I left in 2007 because another corporate job came open, and my wife was always worried about me getting injured or killed and was always pushing me to get back into the corporate career. And so when that opportunity came, I left in 2007. And in 2010, Florence Police Department had an officer who was shot and killed off duty. And I felt compelled to get in touch with the police officers and check on them, because I still knew many of them. And in the process of doing that, they said, Sam, you need to be our chaplain. And I thanked them, just like I told you when I was little, Sam, you're going to be a preacher one day. Like, nice compliment, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
But I had one of my pastor who asked me, where do you see God using you? And I said, I see him using me, to minister to police officers, but I have to be ordained to do that, and I'm not about to go to seminary, 4 years of full-time seminary to be ordained. And he said, well, in the Episcopal Church, you can be ordained as a deacon. And at the time, I had no idea what a deacon was. I've come to learn that priests are ordained to be over a church and shepherding a church. Deacons are ordained to have an outreach ministry. And that was like, eureka, that's what I'm for.
Mm-hmm.
Because I didn't need more to do inside the church. Jesus called us to go out into the world. So in order in the Episcopal Church to be ordained, you have a body of people that are called, some people you know and some that you don't know, and they interview you. And it's a several week period. And if they determine, or if they affirm that that calling is from God, they pass your name on. And in the diocese level, they do the same thing with what's called the Commission on Ministry. They do the same thing, and they interview you, ask you questions to affirm, or, maybe say not right now, whether your calling is from the Lord. When I sat in front of them, I said, I don't hear God's voice audibly. So how do I know the difference between the praise of men, which could just boost your ego and lead you down the wrong path, or God speaking to you through men that says, this is what I want you to do. And I said to them, since I don't have the gift of discernment, I let this body tell me, do you think that God's calling me into this? And they affirmed that calling. So to answer your question, I would say you need to find, if you're interested in this, if you think God's calling you, you need to find other believers in your church, maybe, or other believers that can, especially if they have the gift of discernment. But with prayer, see if you're being called into this, because if the Lord isn't calling you into it, you don't want to do it. You will not last long if this is something you've chosen and the Lord hasn't chosen it for you.
Correct. This is.
I read something in the early church history about. In the early church history, I read something when I was going through your training on martyrdom, and at one point, people thought it was great to be martyred. But I forget who it was, but it was one of the early church fathers who said, if God has called you to martyrdom, he will strengthen you and give you what you need to get through it. But, God help you if he hasn't called you to that, then you've just signed up for yourself. And I think that same thing goes for ministry. Scripture is got a lot of warnings. For me, that was one of the things that, I guess why I was late going into ministry, is I took seriously that caution that not everyone should be leaders, because you do have a lot more attacks as a leader than you do as just a follower.
Well, as with our first responders, our police and our firefighters and our EMS, they see a lot of things, as we've talked about, some pretty horrific things both you and I have seen. And as a chaplain, we see these things because we're actually on scene. We see the death. We see the people getting put into the patrol cars. We see people getting put into body bags. We've occasionally helped put the people into the body bags. That is part of the chaplaincy, especially a part of crisis chaplaincy. And frankly, not everybody's called to do this. And if you're not called to do it, don't do it.
Right.
It's not meant for everybody. So
but it's such a rewarding job. If you are called to do it, it's such a rewarding job. And God, if he calls you to it, he's not going to leave you helpless. My friend Rich Robinson helped me when I did a part of the funeral service for Officer Jackson Winkler, the airport police officer. And Rich helped me with that part of what I was saying in the service, which is, if God has called you to this, he's not going to leave you helpless. That he might not show up in a cloud. When you ask for him, he will show up. It may not be in a cloud or in a whirlwind, but it might be in a uniform. And I love that. That's wisdom. I mean, because sometimes God shows up in the uniform of a SCPSCA chaplain or a fire chaplain or police chaplain.
Yeah. So last question. So kind of a different question, but what desires do you have for being a chaplain? Where do you want to go with your ministry?
I think it's time, especially when you love something, you have a tendency to hold on to that and not want to give it up. I think that we all need to, and I'm 50 years old. I'm no spring chicken anymore. We need to be investing in younger people. We need to be investing in Timothy's like Paul did. So my desire is for us to raise up more chaplains and to train them in the way that they should go. We're doing that here at McLeod with a new training program. It's kind of a mentored ministry program that we are doing in conjunction with some of the seminaries. And I know, Chris, you are an ACPE person with CPE experience. There are training opportunities out there. And I think that people who are interested in chaplaincy need to see how it's done. And so right now, what we are offering at McLeod is kind of that mentored ministry opportunity where when you sign up, we go out and we start ministering and you see how it's done. And then at some point, the chaplain will then shadow the person that's in training. But then at a certain point, they're cut loose and they're allowed to do ministry on their own. But there's always this coming back together and reflecting on how was the visit? What did you say? How did that go? What could have been done better? What could have been, what did you do well? What could have been done better? What did you learn from it? And so for me, the what's next, I never know. I mean, if you were to asking me what's next, COVID would have been over by now. So clearly my ability to plan is not all it's cracked up to be. But I'm enjoying where God has me. And I always say that everything I've done with a long-term vision in place. When I started at the police department, I expected to retire from the police department. I didn't realize I was only going to be there for 3.5 years. But every place I've gone, I've expected to be there long-term. But I've come to realize that God has you where you need to be for a season. And so in this season, he has me here to help continue to build more chaplains, grow more chaplains. The sad thing is my experience has shown, or the things that I've experienced have been that by the time the Lord has our attention, we're all old and gray. There's some comfort in knowing that the person you're going to has life experience. But at the same time, if we are supposed to be reaching the world and the younger people, where are our younger chaplains? We need some younger chaplains. So when you ask me, where do I see myself going? Wherever the Lord calls. And right now, I think it's in helping to build more chaplains, not just because we have a limited capacity in our own resources. We can only do so much. But when we invest in others and we grow the ministry, it multiplies. Like Jesus said to his followers, you will do greater things than I have done, because there were more of them than there was of him.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to sit down with you this afternoon, and you need to share your heart and share who you are. I think it's important for the public to actually know who these chaplains are. Our first responders know us because we live and we work with them. But, for the public to actually understand that who chaplains are and what our hearts are, I think is very important. So thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you, Chris.